Thank you, Mr Speaker. We have heard this morning some shocking reports regarding Palestinian medical staff in Gaza being blindfolded, detained, forced to strip and repeatedly beaten by Israeli troops after a raid on Nasser Hospital last month. There's footage from Khan Yunis showing men stripped and kneeling, and it also shows patients with their hands bound being wheeled in beds. So does the UK government believe that the Israeli government is responsible for the conduct of its forces and that this clearly appears to be torture and is in breach of international law, including Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Geneva Convention Article 18? And what is the UK government going to do about this?
Well, Mr Speaker, she is right to say that Israel must comply with the Geneva Convention she mentioned. We have seen these reports. I think that a full explanation and investigation is required, and that is what the British government is pressing for. And I would point out to her that when it comes to targeting operations, there are lawyers embedded in the Israeli and the IDF command, just as there are in Britain, and that should ensure that the acceptance and honouring of international humanitarian law is kept. But I agree with her, a full explanation is required.
Blomfield.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. For months we've seen the horrifying images of children in Gaza mutilated or killed by bombing. Now we see them starving. Aid by air and sea is welcome, but it's insufficient and it's a diversion from Israel's responsibility. Yesterday, 12 Israeli human rights organisations called out their own government for failing to comply with the International Court of Justice ruling to facilitate access for humanitarian aid. Does the Minister agree that the Israeli government should be told by the UK and our allies to unlock aid and end the killing or face real consequences?
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, as he knows, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have both pressed Prime Minister Netanyahu and indeed President Herzog to ensure that more aid can get into Gaza. And as he will also know, it is the policy of the British government to do everything it can to achieve a pause so we can get the hostages out and more aid in and move towards a sustainable ceasefire. And we are doing everything we can to try and achieve that.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What we are seeing in Gaza is a starvation-level event. The US has taken the desperate measure of airdrops and flotillas which don't direct aid, like land-based aid. The only organisation big enough to fully distribute aid to avoid starvation is UNRWA. Canada reviewed the interim report of the UN Office of Internal Oversight Service and has resumed funding. Sweden received bilateral assurance of the same actions the FCDO is supposedly looking for from UNRWA and resumed funding. It's scandalous the UK government position is still a suspension of funds, despite the interim report and without evidence being provided by Israel in the first place for undoing. The British public don't want to be responsible for starvation in Gaza. When is the Minister going to resume the funding?
Minister.
Well, as I have told the House before, there is no British funding due until April, and enough funds have now come forward in order to ensure that adequate supplies are available. And we are awaiting the report of the UN Office of Internal Oversight and Catherine Colonna, the former French Foreign Minister's interim report, and the view that we take is that when we have seen those, we very much hope we will have the reassurance to recommence funding. That is also the position of the United States, Germany, Australia, Italy, Finland, Netherlands and Switzerland, and I hope that he will be comforted by the fact that we are very much trying to resolve this matter as speedily as we can.
Show the Select Committee unless you can.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Foreign Affairs Committee recently returned from Al Arish, which is the staging point for aid into Gaza. It was very difficult to see thousands of trucks on that border. The government has been clear that Israel has a legal obligation to ensure aid reaches civilians. The last legal assessment took place at the end of last year. So can my right honourable friend tell the House in legal terms, is Israel demonstrating a commitment to international humanitarian law? And if he won't tell us in this House, will he please write to me?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for her visit with the Select Committee and for her comments. We are quite clear that Israel has the capacity and ability to abide by international humanitarian law. We review it on a regular basis, but as of today, that remains the position.
Mr. Speaker, the UN mission team that recently visited Israel concluded that there are reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence occurred in multiple locations during the 7th of October attacks. In the light of that appalling and shocking conclusion, will the government redouble its efforts to get the hostages home because they might be suffering a similar fate to those victims on the 7th of October?
Minister.
Well, I agree with my right honourable friend, and she will know that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary and Lord Ahmed have all met the families of the hostages. I had the privilege of meeting some of the families last week. The second occasion I have done so within the precincts of this House of Commons. She is right. We are doing everything we can to increase the flow of aid and get the hostages home, and we will continue to do so.
Kate.
So the 7th of October massacre was the fact that many ordinary Gazans, reports indicate hundreds or even thousands, followed the Hamas terrorists into Israel and participated in the atrocities. And reports suggest that civilians kidnapped Israelis and sold them to Gaza-based terrorist groups and committed further unspeakable acts of violence and sexual violence. Is my honourable friend aware of those reports? And does he share my concerns at Hamas's ongoing indoctrination of ordinary Gazan citizens?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend makes a good point. I am aware of those reports. The fact remains that the appalling events of October the 7th were, as I've said in the House before, the worst atrocity, the worst killing of Jewish people since the Holocaust and the Second World War. And we continue to want total accountability for the terrible events that took place on that day.
Mr. Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Accepting what the Minister says about there being no money due to go to UNRWA until April, can I say to the Minister, however, that for us to continue not to fund UNRWA sends a truly dreadful signal to other countries on the world stage. Canada and Sweden have resumed their funding. Surely we should be attending to this now as a matter of some urgency.
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I listed the countries that take the same view as us. He is right that there is a division, but for Britain, we are not due to provide any funding now until we reach the next financial year in April. And we will, of course, seek to do everything we can to resolve this matter by the time that funding is due.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Deputy Foreign Secretary confirm that Israel is cooperating with an increasing number of lorries entering Gaza carrying essential humanitarian aid? I've been looking up the figures. 16,405 aid lorries, 203,300 tonnes of food, 26,160 tonnes of water. Isn't it correct that the Israelis have said there's no limit on the amount of aid that can come in, but there is an amount of delay once it's past Israeli checks before it gets into Gaza proper?
Minister.
Well, my right honourable and learned friend is right to say that there has been an increase in the number of trucks getting in. In February, only 97 and on average, and in March, 162. So there has been an improvement. But the House will recognise there is nothing like enough getting through. The easiest way is to do so by truck and by road. It is because that is so difficult that we have had to find other mechanisms, such as the maritime and the air routes.
Shadow Minister Lucian Nandi.
Can I refer him back to the serious allegations from today's BBC investigation that medics in Gaza were detained, stripped and beaten whilst attempting to conduct their life-saving humanitarian duties? All of us in this House have repeatedly called on all parties to abide by international law, but the government has so far declined to say that the ICJ provisional measures should be implemented in full. Will he now tell us that they should? And that the UK will support the ICC investigation led by Andrew Cayley to ensure all allegations against all parties are not only investigated, but that there is accountability for those who break the law.
Well, she is quite right that there needs to be a full and thorough investigation and accountability for what was reported today by the BBC, and I can assure her that the Foreign Office is pressing for full transparency and accountability in that matter.
Surely he can see the problem. Unless the ICJ provisional ruling is implemented and the ICC is allowed to go about its work, those words are simply meaningless. Unless the international community is crystal clear that rules will be upheld by all parties and those who don't will be held accountable, more people will die. Peace is built on the bedrock of international law. So can I ask him again to be clear with this House that the government will support the ICC investigation into Hamas as well as into Israel and will press for the ICJ provisional ruling to be implemented in full, and that international law will be upheld not when it is convenient but always as the precondition to peace?
Well, let me be very clear about that. We did not believe and do not believe that the ICJ referral is helpful in trying to secure dialogue. We respect the role and independence of the ICJ, and we will consider any advisory opinion. We did not think it helpful, without the consent of both parties, for the court to deliver an advisory opinion on what is essentially a bilateral dispute. But we keep all these matters under review, and as I say, our current position is that we believe Israel has both the capacity and intent of abiding by international humanitarian law.
SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
The Minister will have seen the shocking images of parachutes dropping aid into Gaza at the same moment as a barrage of Israeli missiles struck. There is, of course, every chance that both the aid and the missiles originated from the same source. And I wonder at the level of cognitive dissonance required to supply aid to innocent civilians while at the same time providing the means by which Israel can continue to indiscriminately kill them. So when will this government recognise the moral absurdity of selling weapons to Israel while attempting to salve its conscience by airdropping aid to those civilians fortunate enough to have survived that bombardment?
Minister.
Well, I have mentioned, I think, to the honourable gentleman before that in this country we have the toughest arms control mechanisms anywhere. But we accept that Israel has a right of self-defence. And it has to be seen through that prism as well as the prism through which he sees it. But I can tell him that we continually keep these matters under review. That is not only international humanitarian law, it is also the arms export regime, and we will continue to do so.